Hello, today we will be talking about fish behavior, communication, and interactions. We've been talking about behavior a bit in fish, but we've been focusing on the reproductive behavior. So we're going to continue this discussion of behavior, but we're going to move away a little bit, kind of change our focus, and we're going to look at those non-mating social interactions. We can break these into four major groups. We have communication, agonistic interactions, aggregation, and symbiosis. It's a lot of material to cover, so in this lecture, we're just going to focus in on the first two, and we'll come back and touch on the other two in a different lecture. So to start with communication, how do fish communicate with each other? How do they kind of send a signal to another fish? And a lot of this is done through visual displays. We've talked about the coloration patterns on fishes and how that can actually send a signal to another fish. But we have to remember that communication, when we're dealing with visual communication, that the light is different in the water, right? We've talked about this, how different light attenuates to different depths. So if you're a red fish and you're down here in the deep water, you're not going to appear red because there's no red wavelength to reflect. So you actually kind of blend into the background. And you can see how the color spectrum changes with depth. The visibility is also going to be dependent on that transmission quality of the water, right? In order to figure out what light works, what color works best at that depth. Depends on how clear the water is, how turbid the water is. We talked about how that, when we looked at the mating behavior, reproductive behavior, how sometimes that can actually change how a fish interprets another fish. In most habitats, the best colors, the ones you're going to see the best, are black and white. Those are going to be the most visible and offer the most contrast. And we see this color pattern on lots of fish, right? We have dramatic black markings or white markings. If you're in a coral reef or tropical waters where you've got nice clear area, you're kind of shallow, what you're going to see there mostly are the yellows. Those are the ones that are the best transmission quality. And then their complement is kind of this indigo blue on the other side. When you think of a lot of those tropical reef fishes, we do see a lot of that yellow and blue coloration patterns. If you're near shore in temperate waters or you're in a freshwater system, now your best colors to be seen are going to be the reds, and then their complements, the blue-greens here. So again, those are the color patterns we seem to see. Those are the dominant colors used in those conditions. So what is the point of color? Well, if it's static, if it doesn't really change, it can kind of be an identity badge, kind of like that little "Hello, my name is" sticker on the side of a fish. It tells you the fish's species. It can tell you the fish's gender, and in some species, it can even tell you the fish's age. And we can see that on some of our wrasses. Let's see. Where we have specific color patterns associated with juveniles. So when one individual sees another, they know it's a juvenile, not sexually mature, not a threat if you are a breeding individual. We have an initial phase, which is usually the female and then the primary males, not the breeding males. And then the terminal phase where now you're a breeding male, sexually mature male, kind of you're at the top. And by having this sexual dimorphism between males and females, it allows you that identity, right? You can ID who it is you're looking at. And you can also get a clue about the age if we've got a juvenile, immature kind of coloration pattern that is distinctly different from those adults. Fishes can also have what's referred to as dynamic coloration. And this is just basically that they have the ability to change their color. It's usually a rapid change in a color or even an exposure of a colored structure that's usually hidden. And we can see this like in a grunt here. So what the grunts will do is when they're kind of having a head-to-head encounter with another one, they'll open their mouth and this flash of color is kind of their dynamic coloration. We see it short term. Those are usually done through the nervous system. So sometimes when fish are fighting, that we'll actually see the colors patterns change. They'll become more intense or less intense during that display. We can also have long-term changes, and the long-term ones are going to be under the hormone controls. And those could be things like the rainbow darter. And this is here to show you that we too in North America do get some pretty cool, colorful fish. Maybe not as many as we see on the reef, but I mean, he's pretty cool. And this is a seasonal change to show that he is now reproductively ready to defend his territory. When do we see these coloration patterns? I kind of generically talked about fighting fish in the previous slide. Those are actually referred to as agonistic displays. And the idea is that this is ritualized combat. So nobody actually gets hurt. right? There's not physical fighting. It's more of just showing who's stronger without risking any sort of damage. Quite often are done as a series of movements accompanied with a color fight where we're changing our color patterns, the intensity of color in certain parts of the fish. And we see a bunch of different varieties. We have this kind where they're kind of swimming, right? We're looking at these fish from the bottom. It's that lateral display. They're swimming side by side. And it may escalate to getting water currents directed at the other fish. So they'll use their tail fin to kind of move water that way as a way to check to see who is the stronger fish to determine that relative strength. We have lateral display here shown in the clownfish where they're swimming against each other, striking each other with those pectoral fins. And sometimes we'll see this change and become a carousel swimming where they swim in these little tight circles, and that can lead to someone biting the fins of the other fish. But in general, we're still trying to do that ritualized combat, figure out who is the stronger fish. Butterfly fish do the same thing. They'll go head to head and push back and forth. You can think of this as similar, like maybe to how deer or elk will lock antlers and push back and forth. They're not trying to injure each other. They're not like gouging each other with those antlers, right? It's pushing to figure out who is stronger. We do see this a little bit in elasmobranchs. We tend to show teleost fish examples because the bony fishes are so diverse. But in the gray reef shark, they have this very distinct agonistic display that they'll do. So normally the shark is going to swim and he's going to be very flat-bodied in the water, right? And if he was coming at you, it would be nose down and coming directly towards you. And if you looked at that shark from above, you would see that the tail sweeps back and forth to move that shark forward. But for the agonistic display, we see a change in that behavior. Instead of that normal kind of straight-bodied swimming, we have this exaggerated big hump on the back, trying to show you that, hey, I'm here, pay attention. The shark coming at you now does not have that snout down level in the water. It's raised up, very distinct posture. And when we're moving that tail, now we have exaggerated tail movements back and forth. This behavior has been observed when the shark is approached by another shark, or even a small submersible, or yes, even a diver. If you ignore this behavior, which is basically saying, hey, you're getting in my way, you're too close, back off, the shark will attack. Similar behavior has been observed in other sharks, but without an actual attack. So it may be that this kind of communication is telling something to other sharks and other fishes, and they kind of know how to respond to avoid an attack. So that brings us to the colors, right? We're talking about visual communication, things that you can see. We talked about those poster colors when we looked at predator-prey behaviors, right? Those bold patterns, those bright colors that are there. And the thought was that that's allowing the fish to communicate with potential predators. And we talked about it as being disruptive coloration, right? Break that fish up into little pieces so that we can't quite tell that it looks like a fish anymore. We talked about aposematic coloration, where we've got those nice bright colors that say, hey, I'm not something you want to eat. But we have to look at it another way as well. Perhaps it's not so much to avoid predators as it is to know who you're talking to. Perhaps it's for individual recognition. Allows you to identify individuals as they move across the reef. You know, is that my partner? Is that my neighbor? Is this some new fish I've never seen before that I should be paying more attention to? Maybe it's some kind of short-range social signaling that's actually happening here. Those tail spots that we talk about, having the eye on the end of the fin, thinking that, well, then the predator will go for the eye and the fish will go the other way. Maybe they're not for the predator. Maybe they're for your mate. If you're moving as a pair through the reef, having a dot on your end lets your mate following you be able to keep track of you better, especially when you're going through a complex reef like this where you've got lots of other fish and structures to deal with. There's lots of hiding spots on the reef, so maybe predation isn't really a big threat. Maybe this is just for you to be able to see where you're going, where your relatives are, where your neighbors are, who's a stranger. We do see fish communities that don't have as many refuges, not as many places to hide, have less color. So perhaps it is more of a con-specific coloration. You're more interested in telling other members of your species about you than your predator. And when you're dealing with this reef system here, right, with this nice clear water, you're going to see predators pretty well. So your camouflage, maybe it's not as important. And the bright colors might not be as visible over a long distance from where a predator would be, but they're really obvious to someone who's close to you. So that's kind of the confusion. Are fish cryptically colored, like we talked about in predator-prey relationships? Does that coloration pattern help that fish hide, blend into the background, or escape predators? Or are they conspicuously colored so they can say, hey, look, I'm over here, and let their other fish of their species know where they are and what they're doing? They're not mutually exclusive, but it's a different way of looking at the information we've previously discussed. So we talk about visual behavior, but some fish do produce sounds. There's about 50 families of fish that produce sound that we're aware of, and some of these fish could be producing sounds that we're not quite aware of. And they can use these sounds in various ways, produce them differently. They can vibrate their air bladder, that's a popular one, send vibrations out, make a noise. Stridulate their teeth, right? Their bones, their fin spines, there's ways to make sounds that can carry through the water. Why would you do this? Why would you make sounds? Well, it could be a prey response. If a predator comes and goes to pick up a prey fish to attack one, if it can make a sound, that might startle the predator enough to back off and they could escape. Or if they make a lot of sound, maybe it would attract a bigger predator that would eat the fish that's trying to eat you, and then you could escape, maybe. There's some evidence it's for mate attraction. We do see certain fishes, toadfishes, gobies, some of our sunfishes, make sounds that appear to bring females closer to them. And some fish, some of our cods, will actually make the sound more intense as the females get closer. So that seems to be drawing them in to some extent. We do see agonistic interactions as well. So those are those ones where we're trying to kind of show our dominance, keep other fish away. We see that in some of our damselfishes and our croakers, that they'll make a sound and it will actually drive away an intruding male. So the male comes up and you make the sound. And it's like, okay, there's someone here, and then they leave. So that, again, it's a way to avoid that face-to-face combat, right? It's any sort of combat that would actually hurt an individual. And it could be to attract shoal mates, to kind of keep that group of fish together that you're trying to swim with, so that you're all aware of where each other is. It does appear to be a series of almost clicking sounds from fin movements in the shoaling and schooling species. And the thought is that that allows fish to know, individual fish, to know where everyone else is in the shoal and be able to keep their position, kind of keep everybody together. So what do these sounds actually sound like? We'll listen here to a 3-spined toadfish. So a toadfish is going to use its swim bladder to make its sound. The divers referred to it as being underwater and hearing something that sounded like a buzzing cell phone, which is pretty similar to what that sounds like. You could also see that nice cryptic coloration on him, right, where he can blend in well to his environment as a predator. What the call would be for, whether that's to scare someone away by making that sound, is unclear, but it's a very distinct sound and it carries well through the water. So we've talked about sound and how we could use it to kind of maybe let a mate know where we were, or let a potential invader, intruding male, keep away from our territory. But what about predators? Is it a good idea to make a sound if you could potentially be drawing in a predator? We do see that in the more actively schooling groups, the groups of fishes that are normally moving around in a group, that they do tend to make less sounds. We see most of the sound production in our territorial solitary species, which makes sense because if you're kind of by yourself, then you're going to want to advertise that to potential mates. And also if you're defending a territory, it'd be nice to have a sound to keep other males from invading your territory. So we do see it in some. It may be used by predators to actually locate their prey items. Predators, we know, are attracted to that low frequency sounds. Those are sounds that are produced quite often by injured fish or feeding fish. And we know that sharks and some of our larger fishes, bony fishes, our groupers, our jacks, our tunas, barracudas, fish like that are attracted to those sounds. And then the interesting thing is when you look at the bottlenose dolphin diet, they have a disproportionate number of sound producing species in their diet. So that suggests that they are keying in on those species that produce sound and eating those more than they're eating non-sound producing species. So we'll move from sounds to chemical behaviors. We've hinted on this a little bit, the pheromones that fish have. We talked about the Schreckstoff, right? The idea that they can, when we've got the group of schooling fish, if some get injured, they'll release that pheromone from their skin, and the other fish in the school will react to that smell and know that someone's been injured and that they should school up or flee or have some kind of predator avoidance behavior. We do see it in other ways. We see it in parent-offspring identification. So the parents that have that parental care know that these are the young I'm supposed to be guarding and can identify the fish they're dealing with. We do see some evidence of scent marking in territories and refugees shelters where the fish will stay. And fish even have the ability to recognize water from their home territory and water that a conspecific has been swimming in. So there's obviously a lot going on the chemical side. We know that salmon and bullhead catfishes have amino acids in their mucus that allow them to recognize their mate. And they've done some experiments with fish where they'll experimentally blind them and see how well they interact with other fish based on odors. And those experimentally blinded fish can recognize individual fishes based on their odor. If you have the dominant fish in there with the experimentally blinded one and you take it away for like 3 days and let that blinded fish just swim around by itself, when you return that dominant fish, the blinded fish recognizes it and has the correct behavior. So if they take the dominant fish out and it loses a battle with a third fish, so now it's no longer the dominant fish, and you put it back in the tank with a blinded fish who previously was subordinate to it, right? That blinded fish will actually attack the dominant fish. There's some change in its chemical signal that allows that blinded fish to know that this is no longer the top fish anymore. Something about the chemicals present in the mucus. So there's a whole world out there that we're not aware of, that we don't sense the way that the fishes do. And we do take advantage of their ability to smell a bit. We have things like ultrabite, that if you sprinkle this in the water, that the fish will come and the fish will start to feed, and you'll have a feeding frenzy of fish, so that then if you take your baited hook and you lower it down into the water where you've spread your ultrabite, the fish will now snatch at your bite and your bait, and you will catch a fish. The idea here being that we're taking advantage of that olfaction, that chemical behavior that we see in fishes. Tactile behavior, touchy-feely fish. Not really very common. Fish aren't really very touchy-feely. We see it in those fights that we've talked about where they'll push against each other. We see tactile behavior in mating, and we see it a bit in that parent-offspring, right? There's not a lot of fish that have the parental care. There's not a lot of fish that take parental care of the offspring for a length of time, but those that do, that's where we see some of that tactile touching behavior. If we're going to talk about communication, we do have to mention electrical communication. We've talked about this a bit when we talked about electrogenerating fishes and kind of how they use it as a sensory system. And we see this when we look at the fish in detail, that the individual fish have their own signal that they put out that shows that I'm a female, that I'm a male, that I belong to this species. There's a certain frequency that shows that sex recognition. It also shows the dominance, so that the more dominant fish have a different frequency that the other fish can recognize. And we see the fish use this to their advantage if they're fighting. So in this case, we have two black ghost knife fish fighting here. That'll kind of go head to head like that. They'll also be jamming each other with their electrical discharge, with the dominant one trying to show that he's got the better signal as well, and not allow that other fish to be able to receive the same way. We do see some changes if you take a knife fish and you isolate it. The sexually dimorphic portion of the signal will fade. So they'll still have a signal, but it'll switch a little bit. If you introduce a second fish, then that fish will go back to its first original kind of full signal with the sexually dimorphic section as well. So there's a lot of plasticity that they have where they have the ability to adjust. And we see that when the fish come near each other too, right? Whether they're going to jam the other one or keep their signals how they are, there's some ability to change that depending on the situation. So we need to talk about agonistic interactions in detail a little bit more. We'll move away from communication to just focus on the agonistic interactions. And we've talked about how they use them in communication, right? How they use them as part of their behavior. But we need to look into detail a little bit more as to like why you would do this and when this would come up. And we see these interactions when we have defendable resources. And this could be a whole bunch of different resources. This could be food. This is my food patch, stay away. It could be a refuge. This is my little crevice. It could be finding a mate, and it could be guarding your eggs. And what we see is that we get two kind of different results from this. If you're a solitary species, those agonistic interactions are going to create territoriality, that this is mine and you're going to stay away from it. If you are an aggregating fish, if you're one that's found in a school or a shoal, you're going to end up with a dominance hierarchy. So with those behavioral hierarchies that we have, we see kind of two different major types of those. Within that group of fish, you can have a linear hierarchy. The top dog or fish is going to be alpha, and then the next one is beta, and all the way down in the group into the omega. If you take the alpha away, then the beta fish is going to take over its spot, right? And we're kind of in a line. So beta is subordinate to alpha, but dominates everybody else below it. So there's definite ranking order system within the fishes. The other version that we can have is what's called despotic. In this case, we have one to rule them all. We have one individual that's going to dominate all of the others. Everybody below them is of equal rank. If you take that despot away, then there's going to be a struggle to find who the next despot is, but it's not lined up in order like we see in the linear hierarchy. Behavioral hierarchies are determined by a bunch of different factors: your size, your sex, your age. And these are probably all linked, right? We know that bigger fish are older fish. And we know that within the fish species, sometimes it's the males that are larger or the females that are larger. But it's also going to be determined by your prior residency. Were you there before? Is that your refuge? Is that your territory? Or are you trying to take it over? And your previous experience. If you're good at fighting and you're a little bit older and you just have a general better knowledge of things, then you're probably going to win to a point. What is the prize? What does this matter? Well, microhabitat preferences. And that might not seem like a big deal, but you know, someone gets the castle and someone doesn't. And it makes a difference from the fish's point of view. It could be as small as having more cover. It could be having access to prey a little bit better. It could be even just relation to the currents, right? You're in a better spot, you get more oxygen, or you get less disturbance from the current patterns. So there's all these little tiny preferences that matter to that fish, and the hierarchy is going to determine who ends up where in the ranking of the fish. Our agonistic interactions, when we're talking about territoriality, that's a defended space, right? This is for our solitary species now. This is my space, this is where I'm going to be. And it can be a bunch of different things. It can be a personal space, like you got too close to me, back off. Or it could be an area containing a resource that this is what I want to have. We don't see territoriality very much in our agnatha or our elasmobranchs. That threat response we showed for the gray reef shark, that's really unusual. Probably more of a personal space issue than an actual territory. But what we see are these defense displays, and you can see it here in this beta, right? We've got our gills are spread out, we've got our fins spread out, swimming our body, moving it laterally, right? That big exaggerated swimming. There may be vocalizations for some species. We might see those agonistic displays with the chasing and the biting in there. And again, our defense displays are flexible. We're pretty plastic. They're not like made in carved in stone. A larger intruder, we're going to fight more vigorously. If it's someone who's coming through our territory, but they're not really a direct threat, like maybe I eat plants and someone is moving through that eats invertebrates, I might not worry as much about chasing that other fish away as I would if it was someone that was a direct competitor with me. And then we have to look at the territory in kind of view of the home range of the fish. So the territory is usually just the small part that the fish actively defends of a larger home range, a larger area that the fish is going to use for its daily or even its seasonal activities. And this is an important part of their behavior because it depends on how big that home range is. It could be something that's restricted, something small that's like just like a little tide pool, like we see with our pricklebacks. It could be something that's more intermediate, maybe like the area around coral head, like we might see with gobies and damselfishes. So it's a few square meters, a little bit bigger. Or it could be huge, it could be large. Some of those big fish, those open ocean pelagic fishes, our tunas, our large sharks, those are going to be entire ocean basins. So home range varies depending on the species you're looking at. And home range is very important if you're into fisheries and conservation. If you're designing a marine reserve, if you're trying to figure out where people should fish and should not fish, you need to make sure it's large enough to include all portions of that fish's behavior. So this is the results of an experiment done looking at these two emperor fishes. So we've got the thumbprint emperor and we've got the orange striped emperor. And in Guam, they have a reserve they want to put out. So they thought, let's take some of these fish. We're actually going to implant them with ultrasonic transmitters, and we're going to passively track their movements over 4 months and see what they do. So they put transmitters in 12 of the thumbprints and 8 of the orange stripe to see what would happen. And to track their movements, they had little receivers out there so that they could see where the fish moved. And these are the maps they came up with, and the fish appear to be quite restricted. So these are their individual home ranges. You can see here that, right, we're talking 95% of the movement versus 50%. So most of their movement here, 95% is in those pink circles, not a very large area. And we have, let's see, LH is the first fish. We've got 5 examples here of him and 2 of the others. These are indicative of the other maps that were created. And you can see that their nice little home range here is pretty good, that this area is tightly together, would actually be protected by that marine reserve. The problem is this arrow that comes out. And what we see over those 4 months is we saw regularly occurring monthly migration pathways. So they were moving out to these darker shades of water, which are going to be deeper water, probably for mating purposes. So this shows that the home range, the normal home range, would be protected, but these reproductive paths are not part of the reserve. So you need to be aware of the whole picture of the fish when you're looking at kind of how to manage that fish. So we know how big its general home range is, its territory, its home space, but you need to look at that whole behavior to get a picture of how that fish fits in. So this was our overview of the start of our non-mating social interactions. So we're looking at communications, how fish kind of tell other fish what's happening. And we talked about the agonistic interactions, which is a lot of the ways on how these fish actually communicate with each other. If you have any questions about today's material, please send me an email and let me know. Thank you.